Some stories are better heard with someone else. But you're here alone. Welcome to Don't Listen Alone. This is 100% ad-free, just you and whatever comes next. Drop your location and the time before we begin. Now, listen carefully. Not everything you hear is part of the story. Back when I was in college, there was a time that stayed with me for reasons that were not only about what I experienced, but also because of the person connected to it. And even though I cannot remember the exact year anymore, whether it was December of 2001 or December of 2002, I know it was around that time, and I know it was during the Christmas season. And I know that it was the same period when a buddy of ours passed away, which is why the memory has never really faded, and whenever I think back to that night, it is never just about something strange happening in the house, it is also about him, my friend Edward, and the way we all said goodbye to him. Edward was our batch mate from high school, someone we all knew, someone who was always kind and easy to be around, the kind of guy who did not cause trouble and did not make enemies, an all-around good guy. And even though we were not the closest of friends who shared every secret, he was still part of my everyday world back then, part of our circle, part of our stories. And in our high school, which was an all-boys school, the people you studied with were not just classmates, they felt like brothers, because we went through the same teachers, the same rules, the same punishments, the same jokes, and the same battles together, and our batch was like a big fraternity on its own, with its own pride and its own history. It was only when he died that I learned he had been dealing with cancer for years, something he was diagnosed with when he was still young, and it shocked me that he had carried that weight in silence, going to school, laughing with us, getting into the same teenage nonsense, while hiding something so serious, and none of us really knew, or at least I did not know. Until we were standing in front of his casket at the funeral and people started talking about his illness, and that information made his death feel even heavier, because it meant he had been fighting something we could not see, while we were all busy worrying about exams, crushes, and who was fighting who outside the school gates. Our high school had a reputation for getting into fights with students from other schools and with different groups that called themselves fraternities or gangs. And that whole world of rivalry and pride and trouble is a long story in itself, full of old grudges and traditions that did not really make sense anymore but were still passed down year after year. And because of that kind of environment, we grew up always thinking of each other as comrades, as people who would stand beside you if anything happened. And so when Edward died, there was never any question about whether we would go to his funeral. It was automatic, it was understood, it was what you did for one of your own. So on that day, a lot of us showed up, batchmates from different sections, people who had not seen each other in a while, gathering under the same roof again. But this time it was not for a reunion or a celebration, it was to pay our respects to his family and to pray for him. And the atmosphere was heavy and quiet, softer than the noise we were used to in high school. And as I looked at his parents and relatives, I felt a kind of sadness that was different from anything we had felt back when we fought with other schools or worried about teenage problems, because this was final, this was something we could not help him with, and all we could do was stand there, bow our heads, and offer prayers. After the funeral, people started leaving in groups, the way we always did, because that instinct for moving together had never really left us. And also because our school's reputation meant we had gotten used to watching each other's backs, even when the reason for gathering was no longer a fight or a game or a school event, but something like this. I ended up leaving with my friend Arvin, and as we walked away from the funeral place, he suggested that we grab something to eat before heading home, and since he offered to treat me, I agreed without thinking too much about it at first, because food after something heavy like a funeral almost felt like a relief. A way to ground ourselves again, to do something normal after spending hours in an atmosphere filled with grief. It was only when we were sitting and talking over the meal that Arvin explained the real reason why he did not want us to go straight home, and he told me about a belief from his side of the family, because he is Chinese, and they have customs and traditions passed down from their elders that they follow, especially when dealing with things connected to the dead and the spirit world. He said that in their belief, after you visit the dead, especially if you attend a wake or a funeral, you should not go home directly. and instead you should go to different places first, make a few stops, or take different routes, so that if any spirits happen to follow you on the way out, they will get confused about where you live and will not be able to follow you all the way home. When he first said that, I remember feeling a mix of curiosity and skepticism, because it was the first time I had ever heard such a thing, and part of me wanted to treat it as just another superstition, one of those things older people say to scare younger ones, but at the same time, there was a part of me that did not want to disrespect something that his family treated seriously. And since it did not really cost us anything to follow it, I went along with it, and we stayed out a bit, ate, talked, and only then did we separate and go our own ways. When the meal was done, Arvin went off in his own direction, and I headed back to my place, and by the time I got home, it was already night. The whole city had that December feeling, the air a little cooler, the streets quieter, and there was something about the sky that reminded you that Christmas was near, and normally, at that time of the year, the house would be full of life, because my family loved spending the holidays together, but that particular year, they had gone to the province to spend Christmas with my grandmother. And I had stayed behind because I had to guard the house, which meant I was the only one living there for the moment. The house felt bigger and more hollow without the usual noise of people, and because I did not want to feel too lonely, I decided to sleep in the living room on the couch instead of going to my bedroom, because from the couch I could watch TV until I felt sleepy, and somehow having the television on made the emptiness of the house feel less obvious, and I told myself that I could stay up late, maybe even until dawn, because there was no one there to tell me to turn it off or go to bed. It was sometime past midnight when things started to feel different, and this is the part that has stayed so clearly in my memory, even though the exact date has faded. I was lying on the couch, slowly drifting off, that state where you are not fully asleep but no longer completely alert, when suddenly I felt a change in the air, a tension, like a faint static that settled over my skin, and I began to feel strangely on edge, aware in a way that did not feel natural, as if something inside me had suddenly switched on and was warning me softly that I was not alone. It felt like someone was staring at me, not just a random feeling, but a strong awareness, the kind you get when someone is actually in the same room and watching you. But no matter how much I tried to sense where that presence was coming from, I could not pinpoint its location, and in that moment, my sleepiness vanished and my body went into a sort of quiet alert mode. I sat up on the couch, my heart beating a little faster, and told myself that maybe it was just my imagination, that maybe the silence of the empty house was getting to me. But the feeling of being watched would not fade, and eventually I could not ignore it anymore. So I stood up and decided to turn on all the lights in the house and check every room, every corner, every possible place where someone could hide, just to make sure that there was no intruder, and that I was not in real danger. I went from room to room, flipping on switches, opening doors, checking windows, and looking behind things, and everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing out of place, nothing disturbed, and no sign of anyone being there except me. When I had finally made sure that the house was secure, I went back to the living room, and it was at that point that a sudden chill ran up my spine, the kind of cold sensation that starts at the base of your back and climbs slowly up to your neck, and the feeling was so sharp and unsettling that it instantly made me remember what Arvin had told me earlier that night, about spirits following people home after funerals, and about how you were not supposed to go straight back to your house. That memory did not come to me gently. It hit me hard, and for a moment I stood there in the living room, with all the lights on, wondering if maybe something really had followed us, wondering if maybe that uneasy, watched feeling was not just my imagination after all. I stood there and thought about Edward, about the funeral, about how recent it was, and then a strange kind of calm came over me, because instead of panicking, a thought formed in my mind that if it was really my friend, if it was Edward who had come by, then maybe he was only passing through, maybe he was just visiting one last time, and that idea felt more comforting than terrifying, and I told myself that if it was him, I did not want to be rude or scared of him. So I walked over to the kitchen to get a drink of water, both to calm myself down and to do something normal, something physical, and I poured myself a cup of water, drank it slowly, and then placed the cup down on the dining room table in the kitchen, leaving it there as it was, and after that I turned off all the lights again, one by one, until the house returned to that quiet, dark state, and then I went back to the couch and lay down, trying to relax, telling myself that everything was fine, and that I had nothing to worry about. I was just about to drift off again when a sound cut through the silence of the house, a very clear, very distinct sound coming from the direction of the kitchen, and it was the sound of dishes clattering, the noise of something lightly knocking against other things, like plates or cups being moved, and the moment I heard it, the warmth left my body and I felt a coldness spread through me. A deep chill that started inside my chest and expanded outward, because I knew I had turned everything off. I knew I had left the kitchen empty, and there was no one else in the house who could be making that sound. The clattering continued for a brief moment, and then I heard another sound, one that made me picture the scene in my mind without even seeing it, because it was so familiar, and it was the sound of a cup hitting a wooden surface with enough force to be unmistakable, not the light tap of someone gently setting it down, but the more solid sound of something being placed firmly, almost aggressively, onto a table. The moment I heard it, I knew exactly what it was and where it was coming from. It was the same cup I had left on the dining room table, the same cup I had just used, and the knowledge that something unseen was touching it, moving it, slamming it down, made me shiver, my whole body reacting with fear even though I was still lying there on the couch. My heart was racing now, and my imagination was filling the darkness with possibilities, and for a second I felt like a child again, wanting to hide under a blanket, but at the same time, there was still that part of me that remembered Edward, remembered the funeral, remembered how much we had all cared about him, and somehow that thought pushed through the fear and made it easier to speak. I was shivering, my voice probably unsteady, but I managed to say out loud, into the quiet house, "Dude, don't be like that," talking as if I was speaking directly to my friend, as if he were there in the room with me, and the moment those words left my mouth, everything stopped. The sounds from the kitchen ceased completely, the coldness that had wrapped around me began to fade, and little by little, warmth returned to my body, not just physical warmth, but a sense of calm, as if whatever had been there had heard me, had understood, and had decided to stop. The fear that had held my chest slowly loosened its grip, and instead of lying there awake all night, shaken and unable to close my eyes, I felt my body relax, and without even fully realizing how quickly it happened, I fell asleep. After that night, nothing like that ever happened again, nothing involving Edward, nothing involving that same kind of presence, and I never again felt that mixture of being watched and being recognized in the same way. In my heart, I know it was him. I know that somehow my friend had passed by, maybe to check on us, maybe just to say a quiet goodbye, and even though he scared me in the process, I cannot bring myself to be angry about it, and I sometimes joke to myself that when I die and wherever I end up, if I find him there, I am going to smack him lightly on the head for choosing such a dramatic way to let me feel he was around. For knocking dishes in the middle of the night, and slamming a cup on the table. When I was alone in the house, because as much as it frightened me, it also left me with a strange comfort, the feeling that the connections we have with people do not always end the moment their bodies are gone, and that sometimes, in quiet houses and dark rooms, those connections reach across for just one last moment, enough to give you a chill, enough to make you remember, and enough to never let you forget. This happened when I was still working at my previous company, the same one where I had other strange experiences, including what I now think of as the haunted building period of my life. And looking back, I sometimes feel like that job was less of a career step and more of a long, drawn-out invitation into places and moments where the normal rules of the world seemed just a little thinner. One of the privileges of that company, at least on paper, was that we got to travel around the country, moving from client to client, project to project, with all expenses covered, and for someone like me, who enjoyed seeing new places but did not always have the money to do so on my own, it felt like a blessing at the time. We were not tourists in the usual sense, because we still had work to do and deadlines to meet, but there was something satisfying about landing in a new city or town, checking into a staff house or a company dormitory, and getting a quick glimpse of a different part of the country, new faces, new accents, new landscapes, and then packing up and leaving again, carrying only a memory of it all. On one of those trips, on one business travel that seemed normal at first, there were 3 of us assigned to a particular client: Nina, who was a system analyst; Randy, who worked as a programmer; and me, handling technical support. By then we were already comfortable with each other, used to long days of work, shared jokes, and tired evenings, and when the office told us that our next project would be at a cement manufacturing company, we did not think about anything except the tasks on our assignment list and the chance to be away from the main office for 2 weeks. The company we were sent to operated on a very large area, almost like a small industrial town of its own, stretching from the seaside, where they had their own port to receive shipments, all the way up to the mountainous areas, where raw materials were stored, dumped, and processed. And the first time we were driven through the grounds, I remember feeling a little overwhelmed by the sheer size of it. There were multiple buildings, warehouses, dusty roads, huge machines, and the constant low rumble in the background that seemed to come from somewhere just beyond your field of vision, as if the land itself was humming. Our tasks were clearly defined. As a team, we were to set up and establish a distribution and inventory application system that would help them manage their stock, their deliveries, and their paperwork more efficiently. It sounded like standard work: databases, reports, user training, fine-tuning code, but the size and complexity of their operations meant we knew we would be there for at least 2 weeks, maybe more if problems came up. Since we would be staying for an extended period, the company provided accommodations for us at their staff house, and I remember feeling pleasantly surprised when we first arrived there. The staff house was not luxurious in the way of high-end hotels, but for a company-owned building inside an industrial compound, it felt almost like a 2-star hotel, and we were more than satisfied. The rooms were fully air-conditioned, which was a big comfort after hours spent walking under the sun or inside warm offices. There was hot and cold shower available, good food was served at regular times, and to make things even better, there was cable TV and Wi-Fi, which made it easy to unwind after work by watching shows, scrolling online, or just chatting with people back home. Yes, the building itself was a bit old, with that slightly faded look that older structures get when they have been used for years, maybe decades. But overall the place was clean, functional, and quiet, and we joked among ourselves that we were practically on a paid vacation, getting to stay somewhere comfortable while being away from office politics and daily routine, with just enough work to justify the trip, and enough free time in the evenings to relax. The first few nights passed by without anything too unusual happening. We focused mostly on our tasks, visiting the different departments, sitting down with staff who needed the system, checking network connections, setting up machines, testing features and reports. At night, when everything was calmer, we would return to the staff house, shower, eat, and then either gather in one room to talk or go back to our individual spaces to rest. And we did hear some faint sounds during the late hours sometimes, small noises echoing through the hallways or drifting from somewhere nearby, the kind of eerie sounds that old buildings make when the wind passes or when pipes expand and contract. And although occasionally one of us would raise an eyebrow or make a remark about it, we did not really think of those sounds as anything spooky. When you work in big industrial areas, you assume there will always be some kind of noise in the background, whether from machines, workers, or the structure itself. So those first few nights we simply accepted it and carried on. It was only during our second week there that things started to shift, moving gradually from slightly strange to genuinely unsettling. One night, Randy decided he would not go back to the staff house yet, because he wanted to stay at the IT room with their internal staff to finish some code. The company operated 24 hours a day, so even at night there were employees moving around, shifts of workers still handling operations, and the IT room remained active, which meant Randy had company and access to everything he needed, and there was nothing odd about his decision. Nina and I, however, decided to call it a day, and we headed back to the staff house together. That afternoon, it had rained, one of those steady rains that soak everything and leave the ground damp for hours, and by the time we were walking across the front yard of the building, the rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with moisture, the grass and pavement glistening with leftover water, the atmosphere cold and foggy, so that the edges of things seemed a little blurred, and you could see your breath if you exhaled deeply. The staff house, with its old structure and simple lines, looked a little more serious under that kind of weather, but we were mostly focused on getting inside, drying off, and resting. As we were making our way toward the entrance, we both happened to look up at the second floor, at the row of windows just beside the rooms where we were staying, and at one of those windows, we saw the figure of a woman. From that distance, and with the lights creating shadows behind the glass, we could not make out her full features, but the outline of her body, the way she stood, made it very clear that we were looking at a woman and not a man, and the way she seemed to be there just by the window, watching quietly, caught our attention. We could not see her face clearly, or what she was wearing in detail, but we saw enough to know there was someone there, and at first we did not think too much of it. We assumed she was another guest staying at the staff house, maybe an employee from another department, maybe someone else on business travel like us. We exchanged a quick look, mentioned it casually, and continued walking inside, not wanting to jump to any strange conclusions. When we reached the second-floor hallway, however, the atmosphere changed. The corridor was empty, silent in a way that made our footsteps sound louder than they should, and there was no sign of anyone else being there. No open doors, no movement, no voices. We walked past the room where we thought the woman's window was and found nothing, and for a brief moment, something inside me tightened, as if a small piece of discomfort had just settled into place. Still, we did not want to make a big deal out of it, and we tried to brush it off, telling ourselves that whoever we saw must have gone back inside her room quickly, or that maybe we had misjudged the exact window we saw her in. I could sense that Nina was a bit uneasy, though, even if she was trying not to show it, and that small doubt about what we had seen remained in the back of my mind as we went inside our room. Nina's room was actually connected to ours, divided only by a partition, so it felt like we were sharing a larger unit that had been split into two spaces, and that closeness usually made things feel safer. But that night the feeling of being side by side did not completely erase the image of the woman at the window. We turned on the television and tried to relax, letting some random show fill the room with light and sound, and at first everything seemed normal. Then, while we were watching, we suddenly heard a voice coming from inside Nina's room. It did not sound like casual talking or someone on a phone. It was more like a steady murmur, soft but clear enough that we both stopped what we were doing to listen more carefully. The tone of it was strange, like a prayer or a chant, repetitive in rhythm, but we could not make out the exact words, and the language itself was not immediately recognizable. We glanced at each other, both now fully alert, and the sound continued for a few moments, rising and falling in that same low, steady way. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but at the same time I did not want to jump to conclusions, so I decided to get closer. Instead of standing up straight and walking boldly to the door of her room, I found myself moving carefully, almost instinctively, as if I did not want whatever was on the other side to notice me. I started to crawl across the floor to get nearer to the partition door, trying not to make any loud sounds, and when I reached it, I slowly placed my hand on the door and began to open it, expecting to see someone inside, maybe a staff member who had entered by mistake, or maybe a hidden radio or TV left playing, anything that would make sense. But when the door opened enough for me to look inside, there was nothing, no person, no source of the voice, no movement at all. The room was perfectly still, the bed in place, the things Nina had left there undisturbed, and the sound had stopped as abruptly as if someone had pressed mute. I felt a wave of confusion and a little fear, but I tried to laugh it off, saying to Nina that maybe it was just our imagination, maybe it was the television echoing strangely, or maybe the sound came from outside and bounced oddly into the room. She forced a laugh as well, and we both decided not to think too much about it. Eventually, tired from the day's work and from our restless curiosity, we went to sleep. The next morning, however, whatever calm we had managed to force on ourselves was shaken. I woke up to the sound of Nina screaming, not a loud, panic scream that echoed through the whole building, but a sharp cry of shock and fear that made me sit up quickly. She was looking down at her legs, her face pale, and when I rushed over to see what was wrong, I saw that she had scratches on her skin. They were not deep enough to bleed heavily, but they were clear, visible, and looked like they had been made by something with nails or claws, thin red lines that should not have been there. She was terrified, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes as she kept asking how, where, who. Randy came in too when he heard her, and he tried to calm her down, speaking in a soothing tone, saying that maybe it was just some kind of allergy or rash, reminding us that we had eaten seafood the previous day, and that perhaps her body had reacted in a strange way during the night. His explanation was practical, and for someone listening from the outside, it might have sounded reasonable, but I could tell from the way Nina looked at him, and then at her own legs again, that she did not really believe it deep inside. She was troubled the entire day, quieter than usual, her mind clearly replaying the events of the night, the voice we had heard, the empty room, and now the scratches, and I could not blame her for being upset. I decided to check her room myself, examining the bed, the floor, the corners, and then checking our room as well, looking for any sign of insects, sharp objects, or animals that could have caused those marks, but I found nothing. No signs of rats or cats, no broken wood, no exposed nails, nothing that could be used as an easy answer. That afternoon, after some time at the office, I returned to the staff house to get some documents for Nina. I walked up the now familiar hallway, inserted the key, and opened the door to our room, and as soon as the door swung inward, right there in front of me, something passed by. It happened so quickly that if I had blinked at that exact moment, I might have missed it, but my eyes were open, and I caught it, just a quick movement, like a figure or a shadow moving across my field of vision, close enough that I could tell it was not a trick of light or my own reflection, and yet too fast for me to see clearly what it was. It was like a presence crossing the space between 1 second and the next, and then it was gone. For a moment I could not speak or react. My body simply froze in place, my mind struggling to understand what I had just seen, all the earlier incidents suddenly rearranging themselves into a pattern that was getting harder and harder to ignore. After a few seconds, my instinct to get away kicked in, and I quickly turned, stepped out of the room, and went straight back to the office, my heart still beating faster than normal. I did not mention what I had seen to Nina because I knew it would only add to her fear and anxiety, and she already had enough on her mind with the scratches and the voice from the previous night. Instead, I shared it only with Randy, quietly, when we had a moment alone, and his face grew serious as he listened, the way someone looks when the situation they were hoping to dismiss as coincidence starts to feel more real. That night, things seemed calmer on the surface, and Nina, perhaps tired from worrying, actually looked more at ease and was able to sleep soundly, which was a relief for both of us. But the following day, it was Randy's turn to experience something he could not explain away. He told us later that while he was in the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror, washing his hands or perhaps brushing his teeth, he suddenly felt someone touch his head. It was not a hard blow or a painful hit, but more like a soft push or a firm, deliberate pat, the kind of touch you feel when someone presses their palm briefly against you, and it came from behind him. He looked up, startled, expecting to see someone there, maybe one of us playing a prank, but when he turned around, the bathroom was empty. He then noticed, in the hours that followed, that he was seeing shadows along the hallway and near Nina's room, shapes that flickered at the edge of his vision, as if someone was moving just out of sight. He told me about these things, but again, we both agreed not to share the details with Nina, wanting to protect her from more fear. Instead, we quietly decided to be more watchful and alert, keeping an eye on each other, and trying to make sense of what was happening in that old staff house. On our last day there, we stayed late in one of the offices to finish the turnover documents, the formal paperwork that needed to be completed and signed before we could officially say that the system was implemented and that our part of the work was done. It was around midnight, and because it was a weekend, only a few workers were outside, the compound much quieter than usual. Inside the office, it was just the three of us, our table covered in papers, computers still on, eyes tired but minds pushing to finish so we could rest. While we were working, we heard the office door open and close a couple of times. The sound was clear, the distinct clink and shift as the knob turned, followed by the familiar click of the door, and the slight frame vibration that comes with it. At first, we assumed it was just other employees coming in to check something or passing through, and because we were busy, we did not immediately look up. But after a while, when the sound repeated and no one seemed to be entering or greeting us, curiosity and unease began to creep in, and we finally decided to check. We looked toward the door, opened it, and saw that the hallway was empty. Nobody had gone in or out except for us. That was when the strangeness took a step closer. Soon after, we heard the sound of a steel cabinet opening, and not just a faint sound, but the loud, scraping metal noise of a cabinet door being pulled open across the tiles, coming from just across our table. The three of us stopped what we were doing, our eyes meeting in a mix of fear and disbelief, because we knew no one else was in the room, and we could see the cabinet with our own eyes, its door now ajar without any of us having touched it. That was enough to shake whatever composure we had left. Panicking, we gathered our things, switched off what we could, and hurried out of the office, walking as quickly as we could without breaking into a full run, moving through the quiet compound back toward the staff house. Once inside, we decided we did not want to be separated that night. Instead of each of us sleeping in our own spaces, we chose to stay together in one room, keeping close as if that closeness itself would be a barrier against whatever was moving around in that building. Nina's room was the one we chose, and we locked the door, made sure the lights were on, and agreed on where each of us would sleep. I chose to sleep on the floor, close to the bed, where I could still see the door. Randy took the couch, and Nina stayed on the bed. Before trying to sleep, we said a prayer, each of us silently hoping for protection, for calm, for the night to pass without any more disturbances, and eventually, exhaustion began to pull us toward sleep. Around 4 in the morning, however, I was awakened by a smell. At first, it seemed like the smell of something cooking, like food being prepared somewhere nearby, and it slowly pulled me out of sleep. When I opened my eyes, I saw that Randy and Nina were already awake too, both lying still but with their eyes wide open, staring into the room as if they, like me, were trying to understand what was happening. We did not say anything immediately. We just stayed there for a moment, listening, breathing, and noticing how the room felt. The silence was heavy, so complete that even the smallest sound seemed like it would echo, and yet this strong smell was there, filling the air, reaching us without any visible source. At first, we tried to make sense of it by telling ourselves it might be someone in the kitchen outside or maybe a nearby house cooking early in the morning. But as we lay there, the scent shifted in our minds, and we slowly realized that it was not the smell of food being prepared. It was closer to the scent of something else, something more familiar in a different context. A smell like burning wax, like a candle that has been lit for some time. That realization crept into our thoughts almost at the same time, and before we could fully react or speak our suspicions out loud, a knock came at the door of Nina's inner room, the same room that we had locked from the inside. The knock was not loud enough to break down any door, but it was firm and clear, the kind of knock that tells you someone is definitely there on the other side, waiting to be acknowledged. The combination of the smell, the silence, and the knock was more than any of us were prepared to handle at that hour, especially after everything we had already gone through in the previous days. Without needing a long discussion or argument, the three of us reached the same decision almost instantly. We quickly packed our things, grabbing our bags, clothes, anything we could gather swiftly, and hurried out of the staff house, not looking back more than necessary. It was still very early, around 4 in the morning, and the air outside was cold against our skin, but despite the chill, we were sweating, our hearts racing, our breathing heavy from a mix of fear and adrenaline. We walked to the cafeteria, which was thankfully open, and decided to stay there, inside a more public space with lights and at least the idea of other people possibly being around, even if they were not yet awake. We waited there until sunrise, watching the darkness slowly lighten through the windows, feeling a bit safer with each passing minute. By around 5:30 in the morning, we had already made up our minds. We were going to leave. We went to the office and told them that something urgent had come up back at our main office, and that we needed to leave immediately, especially since we still had to travel a considerable distance. The reason we gave them was not entirely true, but it was easier to say that than to admit we were leaving because of things we could not see or explain. Fortunately, they accepted our explanation without pressing too hard, perhaps assuming it was normal company business. We handed over the documents, had them signed, collected our gate passes, and left the compound as soon as we could, relief washing over us as the staff house and its old walls fell farther behind. We never told anyone at that company about what we had experienced there, and even when we returned to our own office, we kept the story between the three of us, as if speaking it out loud to others would somehow bring it back to life. We did not ask for more information about the staff house, did not investigate its history, did not try to confirm whether others had encountered anything similar. In a way, not knowing felt safer. Eventually, all three of us resigned from that company at different times, moved on to other jobs and other lives. But whenever I think back to that cement plant, its vast grounds, and that old staff house that looked so welcoming at first, I cannot help but remember the woman in the window, the voice in the empty room, Nina's scratches, the shadow that passed in front of me, the unseen hand on Randy's head, the cabinet door. The smell of burning candle at 4 in the morning, and that final knock from behind a locked door, and I still feel a quiet shiver, the kind that reminds you that some places keep their own stories, whether anyone is willing to listen or not. During the work week, I stay in my mother's ancestral home in the city, the house that belongs to her parents, because our actual family home is too far from my job, and commuting back and forth every day would be exhausting and impractical, so I only go back there on weekends. Over time, all of us who live in this ancestral house have come to quietly accept that we probably share it with an unseen housemate, some kind of presence that we cannot see but sometimes notice in other ways. We do not feel as if it is out to harm us or make our lives miserable. It does not bother the regular residents enough to drive anyone away, and we have never felt directly attacked or threatened by it, which is why we have learned not to mind too much. Instead, we slowly came to the conclusion that whatever it is seems to reveal itself more often to new faces, visitors, or people who do not stay there regularly, as if it is more curious or more active when someone unfamiliar enters its space. To explain this better, it helps to picture the house itself. It is a 2-story structure with 4 rooms in total. 2 of those rooms are on the 2nd floor, and those upstairs rooms are where I sleep during the week. I occupy 1 room on that floor, and my 2 cousins share the other one. The strange thing about the 2nd floor is that, despite the bedrooms being there, people in the house do not usually go upstairs unless they really need to. There is not much to do up there aside from resting, because there are no televisions, no computers, and almost no appliances at all except for a lone electric fan. It is a quiet, simple area with long stretches of empty hallway, and it can feel a bit dull and isolated, so most of the daily life of the household takes place downstairs, where the kitchen, living area, and main entrance are. We only go up when it is time to sleep, or when we have to get something from our rooms. I should also mention that I personally dislike loud, sudden noises at home, especially the heavy banging of doors and the sound of footsteps that seem like they are being dragged or stomped. I have always been sensitive to those kinds of sounds, and that preference makes the strange events that happen in this house feel more noticeable to me. Over the years, different people have experienced things that seem to point to the same unseen presence. One of the earliest and most persistent stories came from my uncle's wife. A few years ago, my uncle moved into the house with her, and during her first year of living there, she would often mention that she saw a white lady at night. She described it as a female figure, pale and clothed in white, appearing in certain parts of the house when everything was quiet. At first, we did not take her seriously. We thought that maybe she was just tired, or that her imagination was playing tricks on her because she was new to the place and still adjusting to its atmosphere. None of us, the regular residents, had ever seen a white lady ourselves, so it was easy to brush off her stories as dreams or exaggerations. She did not seem unstable or overly dramatic, but because the rest of us did not share the same experience, it was convenient to decide that what she was seeing might not be entirely real. Still, her repeated comments planted the first small seed of curiosity and unease. Then my aunt, whose own family also lives in that house, hired a helper for the household. The helper stayed with us for a few months, helping with cleaning, errands, and other chores. She seemed normal and responsible at first, but later on, she resigned and left after only a brief period, and her reason was unsettling. She told us that she had been hearing the door of one of the rooms upstairs slamming, not just gently closing, but banging as if someone was deliberately pushing it shut again and again. This happened at times when there was no one else upstairs. The rest of us, who rarely went to the second floor except to sleep, were not usually present when these things occurred, and the helper was often left alone to go up and down as part of her chores. She insisted that she had heard the door on the upper floor banging more than once, and that it felt intentional, not accidental. Because I especially dislike loud door noises, her story stayed with me. After hearing that, it became harder to laugh off the earlier accounts, and slowly, the image of a restless, unseen housemate became more believable. Another experience involved my cousin's girlfriend, who had visited him in the ancestral house. On one occasion, she asked him if I was at home, saying that she had just seen someone go upstairs to the second floor, where our bedrooms are. She saw a figure heading up, and naturally assumed it was me, because she knew I stayed there during the work week and that my room was upstairs. The strange part is that I was not at home at that time. It was my day off from work, and I had gone back to our main house, so I was nowhere near the ancestral home. When my cousin told her that I was not there, she was confused, because she was sure she had seen someone climb the stairs. That meant that either she had mistaken someone else for me, or she had seen something that was not one of us at all. The second floor, as far as we knew, was empty at that moment, yet she clearly believed she had watched someone go up in that direction. We did not want to alarm her, so we did not dramatize it, but inside, it was one more piece added to the quiet puzzle of the house. There was also an incident that involved one of our neighbors, who noticed something unusual while passing by the front of our house. During the daytime, we usually leave the front gate and the main door open, allowing light and air to enter. One day, this neighbor teased me and my aunt, smiling and making a playful comment about seeing us dancing inside the house. She said that on a certain morning, she had walked past and looked in, and she saw my aunt dancing inside the house. She even mentioned that she saw what she thought was me dancing along with my aunt, and she found the sight so amusing that she nudged her sister-in-law, who was with her at the time, and asked her to look as well so they could both enjoy the scene. The problem with this story is that it did not match reality. Yes, it is true that my aunt has a daily routine of dancing or working out in the mornings. She likes to move along to music as a form of exercise, and it is quite normal for her to do that alone inside the house. But I am never there in the mornings. Because of my work schedule, I am out of the house during that time, and my job keeps me until the afternoon. There is no situation where I would be dancing with her in the morning, especially not on a regular workday. On top of that, at around the time the neighbor claimed to have seen us dancing, there were no other women in the house. My aunt's daughter and our grandmother were out of the country at that time, and my uncle's family, including his wife, had already moved out. So if the neighbor truly saw two female figures dancing inside the house, one of them being my aunt, who was the other? She was so convinced that it was me that she had confidently told the story to us later, but I knew for a fact that I was somewhere else entirely. This added a different kind of chill to the situation, because it meant that the presence was not only making sounds or being seen in quick glimpses. It might also appear as a full figure, enough to be mistaken for a living person, and it did so in broad daylight, not only at night. The same cousin's girlfriend who had once thought she saw me go upstairs encountered something again while I was away on another day. According to her, she heard the door upstairs banging and heard footsteps walking around above them. Once again, this happened at a time when no one else was on the second floor, and I was not even in the house. The footsteps were not light or uncertain. They sounded very much like someone moving around with purpose, the way an actual person would walk from one area to another, and the door noises matched the kind of loud, deliberate banging that the helper had complained about before she resigned. It was as if the unseen housemate was making its movements known, not in whispers, but in clear, physical sounds that others could easily hear and identify. For people who were not used to such things, these experiences were disturbing, and I could imagine how frightening it must have been for someone visiting for the first few times. Then, just a few weeks ago, our area experienced something serious and dangerous, which was a fire in the house behind ours. Some of the neighboring houses were affected, and for a while there was chaos, fear, and the threat that the flames might spread, but we were fortunate. The ancestral house remained safe, and the fire did not reach us, although it came very close. After that incident, however, something changed in the way the unseen presence in our home behaved. It seemed to grow more active, or at least more noticeable. Its manifestations became more frequent and harder to ignore. Even my cousin and my aunt's husband, both of whom had previously been less vocal about experiencing anything unusual, began mentioning that they could hear someone walking upstairs at times when they knew the second floor should be empty. They could clearly distinguish the sound of footsteps from other noises, and they were certain the sounds were coming from within the house, not from the neighboring homes. Our walls are separate from the houses beside us, with enough distance and difference in structure that we have become familiar with how sound travels in the area. We can tell when a sound is coming from outside, from a neighbor, and when it is originating from within our own walls. The sounds of movement and banging we described were definitely originating from upstairs in our house, often near the area where my room is located. The entity, whatever it may be, seems to prefer staying on the second floor, as if that level of the house is its chosen territory, its comfort zone. That happens to be the same floor where my own room is, which could feel unnerving if I allowed my imagination to run wild. But the strange thing is that it rarely, if ever, shows itself to me directly when I am there. I hear about it from others, and I see how new people react, but I do not experience the most intense episodes myself. In a way, if it truly prefers to stay upstairs, then I am sharing that floor with it whenever I come back from work. But as long as it does not interfere with my sleep or my routines, I do not feel the need to challenge or confront it. I am honestly just grateful that it seems to keep a respectful distance when I am around. It reveals itself to visitors, to new faces, to people who are not yet used to the energy of the house, and maybe that is its way of announcing that this place is not entirely theirs, that someone else was here first and intends to stay. As for me, I have made peace with the idea that I might be coexisting with something unseen. My attitude is simple: as long as we both mind our own business, as long as it does not move my things, harm anyone, or make its presence felt in ways that push me beyond my limits, then it can have its silence and its upstairs space, and I will have my room, my work nights, and my weekends away, knowing that the ancestral house carries not only the memories of my family, but also a quiet, watchful presence that seems to belong to it just as much as we do. My first real experience with something I would call paranormal is so deeply etched into my memory that I know I will never forget it for as long as I live, not just because of how strange it was, but because it is tied to one of the people I loved most in this world, my grandfather, and to one of the most painful and important moments of my childhood. On my mother's side of the family there are 11 of us grandchildren, and my grandfather loved all of us, but many people in the family would joke, or even half-seriously argue, that I was the more favored Apo, the grandchild who somehow had a special place in his heart. I do not say that to boast, but to explain how close we were, because this closeness is part of why what happened affected me so much. When I was around 8 years old, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer. He was a simple man in many ways, quiet and humble, but he was also very artistic and had a strong devotion to our Catholic faith. He loved the Blessed Virgin Mary deeply, not in a casual way, but with the kind of loyalty and reverence that shows in someone's daily habits, the way they pray, the way they talk about their faith, and the way they choose to live. During the years that he was fighting his illness, our family adjusted to a new routine. My grandparents' house became almost like a second home to us, because for about 3 years we grew accustomed to visiting them every single day. It was not a chore. It was just what we did, because we wanted to be there for them and because we all knew, even if we did not say it out loud, that the time we had with him was becoming precious and limited. I remember clearly that the atmosphere in that house during those years was a mixture of sadness and normal family life, with difficult moments but also laughter, stories, meals, and quiet companionship. And then there was that one afternoon, the day he died, that is burned into my memory in such detail that I can replay it like a scene from a movie. The sun was still up, and the house had that late afternoon light coming through the windows. My mother, who is a doctor, was on the telephone, and I remember her voice raised in frustration and worry because my grandfather's oxygen tank had been empty for almost 2 hours, and still the replacement had not been delivered. She was angry and scared at the same time, yelling at the other person on the line, asking how they could let something like that happen, and even though I was young, I could feel from her tone that the situation was serious. I, on the other hand, was at the dining table, preoccupied with the kind of thing an 8-year-old would think is important, playing with a pair of scissors, cutting bits of paper, completely unaware that I was making the adults nervous, because children do not usually understand how quickly something can go wrong. My grandmother was in the kitchen doing the dishes, moving around the way she always did, busy but calm, while my grandfather lay in his bed nearby. The bed was close to the dining table, so he could easily see what I was doing. When he saw me playing with the scissors, his voice, even weakened by illness, reached me clearly. He scolded me gently but firmly, and his last words to me were, "Toto, be good." It was a simple phrase, something he had probably said before in different words or at different times, but that day it carried a weight I did not know how to recognize at the time. For him, it was a warning about the scissors, a reminder to behave, but later on it became something more in my memory, like a final blessing, a last instruction from a grandfather to his grandchild. Those words were my cue to stop what I was doing and leave the house to rejoin my sister and my cousin, who were talking outside. I obeyed, still not fully aware of how close we were to losing him. I stepped out of the door, and just a few moments later, from outside, I heard my mother scream. Her voice was loud, raw, and unlike any sound I had ever heard from her before. At the same time, I could hear my grandmother crying from inside the house. My sister, my cousin, and I rushed back in without thinking, drawn by panic and confusion, and we saw at once what had happened. My grandfather was lying still on his bed, and the adults were gathered around him, their faces in shock and grief. Without needing anyone to explain, we understood, in the way children understand big things without all the details, that he was gone. We ran to his side and started crying, all of us crowding around the bed, clinging to the edge, touching his hands, his blanket, whatever part of him we could reach. None of us wanted to leave him, as if staying physically close could stop time or bring him back. It must have been almost an hour that we stayed like that, just crying and refusing to move from his side, while the adults moved in and out of the room, making calls, talking softly, preparing themselves for the arrangements that would have to follow. I was positioned slightly at the back of everyone, and at some point, the exhaustion of crying and the overwhelming emotions became too much for my young body. Still on the floor near his bed, surrounded by grief, I somehow fell asleep. What happened next did not feel like an ordinary sleep. I slipped into a dream that felt more vivid and real than most waking experiences. In my dream, I found myself in an empty space. I call it a room for lack of a better word, but in truth I could not see any walls, corners, doors, or windows. Everything around me was white, floor, ceiling, surroundings, if there were any surfaces at all. It was as if I was standing in a vast space made entirely of light, with no shadows, no furniture, nothing to anchor me to a specific place. In the middle of this white emptiness stood my grandfather. But he did not look like the sick, frail man lying on the bed in our house. He looked healthier, more like the version of him I remembered from before the cancer, the way he was when he could still stand straight and walk around, when his eyes were bright and his face was full. He seemed confused and restless, looking around as if he were searching for a door, a passage, any path that would let him leave that white space. But there was nothing there for him to walk toward. He would look in one direction, then in another, and every time he turned, this pure, blank whiteness stretched out endlessly. For a moment, I just watched him from wherever I was, unable to move or speak, witnessing his confusion and the anxiety that began to show on his face when he realized he was trapped. Then, after a short while, 3 men appeared behind him. They had not been there before. One second there was only my grandfather, and the next second they were simply there, as if they had stepped in through invisible doors. They were very well dressed, wearing handsome coats, like men going to a formal event or important meeting. Their posture was confident, and there was nothing obviously frightening about them at first glance. They looked like respectable, middle-aged gentlemen, and they started to wave at my grandfather, signaling for him to come toward them, as if they were inviting him to follow them into some direction I could not see. There was something strange and unsettling about the way they beckoned, but nothing overtly threatening yet. My grandfather, however, did not seem comfortable with them. He refused their invitation, shaking his head or stepping back. And I could see a shift in his expression, a kind of anxious determination, as if he knew that whatever they were offering was not good, as if his instinct told him to stay away from them. His desire to leave that place grew stronger, and I could feel his worry even in the dream. Then, in an instant, the three men changed. Gone were the respectable coats, the nice faces, the neat appearance. In their place stood horrible creatures, monstrous beings with twisted features and very angry faces. Their wings, if you could call them that, looked torn and damaged, hanging from their backs in ragged pieces as if they had been ripped or burned. Their hands were no longer human. They had claws, sharp and cruel, and everything about them radiated hatred and rage. The transformation was sudden and terrifying, but even more terrifying was the way they began to move toward my grandfather, as if they intended to drag him away by force. Just as the fear in the scene reached its peak, something else happened. In front of my grandfather, a stairway appeared out of nowhere, forming itself out of the white space like a solid path leading upward. The stairs did not seem to be attached to anything, but they were clearly there, a way out, a direction to run. Without looking back at the monstrous forms behind him, my grandfather turned and ran up the stairs. He did not hesitate or pause. He climbed step after step, going higher and higher, while the creatures remained behind, unable to stop him. As he approached the top, a door materialized at the end of the staircase, and when it opened, a blinding light flooded out in all directions. The light was so strong that it washed over everything, pushing away the darkness and making the monsters disappear, like shadows burned away by the sun. Standing in that doorway, outlined by the light, was a figure I recognized not by detailed features, but by the shape and what she was holding. It was the silhouette of the Virgin Mary, carrying a baby in her arms. Even though I could not see her face clearly, I knew it was her. The love and peace that radiated from that image was unmistakable, especially to a child who had grown up seeing statues and images of her, hearing about her devotion, and knowing that his grandfather was a loyal devotee. My grandfather stopped for a brief moment, smiled in a way I had not seen in a long time, and then stepped through the door beside her. As he entered, everything dissolved into light. That was the moment I awoke. When my eyes opened, I found myself lying on the floor near his bed, and everyone around me realized at the same time that I had been sleeping there. The crying, the grief, the heaviness of the room came back into focus. I told them, in my small 8-year-old voice, every detail of the dream I had just had. I described the white space, the healthier version of my grandfather, the 3 handsome men who turned into monsters, the stairs, the blinding light, and the Virgin Mary at the top with the baby in her arms. They listened while still mourning, and we continued to cry, my dream becoming one more layer in the complicated emotions of that day. Days passed, and then came the wake, which was held in my grandparents' house. They placed my grandfather's coffin in one of the empty units of their apartment, turning it into a space where family and friends could come to pay their respects. People came and went, praying, talking softly, sharing food and memories, and the atmosphere was a mix of sorrow and shared comfort. One night during the wake, my grandmother called out to her 3 daughters, my mother and her 2 sisters, as well as the 2 daughters-in-law, to gather inside the room with the coffin. She wanted to speak to them privately about something important. She ordered us, the grandchildren, to leave the room while they talked. I was still the mischievous child I had always been, even in the middle of all that sadness, and my curiosity got the better of me. Instead of going far away as I had been told, I quietly hid myself beside the door, careful not to be seen, so that I could eavesdrop on what the adults were talking about. From that place by the door, I heard my grandmother begin to speak. She relayed to them a story that my grandfather had told her in the nights before he died. It was about a strange experience he had had while he was still alive but already very sick. She said that one night, my grandfather was visited by 3 men who appeared in his room. They were dressed very formally, much like the men in my dream, wearing proper clothes, looking respectable and serious, and they asked my grandfather to come with them. It was as if they were inviting him to leave this world and go somewhere with them. My grandfather refused their offer. He said no, and when he did, he watched as those 3 men instantly transformed into demonic beings, their appearance changing from human to monstrous, just like in my dream. They began to drag him, trying to force him to go with them, and he struggled, feeling their power and their hatred. He only managed to escape when the Virgin Mary appeared and drove them away, shooing them off, making them disappear. My grandmother went on to say that when he woke up from that nightmare, he was actually angry with the Virgin Mary. He told her that in the dream he had been calling out to her, begging her to take him, to let him go with her instead of with those dark figures. But she did not take him, and she vanished, leaving him feeling rejected and hurt, even though he still loved her deeply. As I listened at the door, hidden from their view, my grandmother's next words stayed with me. She told her daughters and daughters-in-law, "What Toto saw in his dreams was his Lolo telling us all that he has been reunited with the Virgin Mary." For her, the similarity between his experience and mine was not a coincidence. She believed that my dream was his way of sending a message, showing us that this time, when the 3 formal men returned to pull him away, he did not end with them. Instead, he found the stairway, the light, and finally reached the one he had devoted himself to for so many years. To this day, none of the adults who were in that room knew that I overheard that conversation that night at the wake. They believed they were speaking privately, but as a child with a secret spot by the door, I carried that knowledge alone. That same night, I also learned something about my family that I had not known before. My aunt, my mother's youngest sister, revealed herself to be a palm reader, and a very good one, as I would come to see later in life. She said that it is common for a third eye, or a sixth sense, to run in families, appearing in different forms in different members. She examined my palm and said she was surprised that my own sensitivity seemed to express itself through dreams rather than through visions while awake. It was as if a quiet thread connected my experience to my grandfather's, both of us being pulled into the same struggle between darkness and light, and both of us being shown, in different ways, that he was eventually led to safety. My grandfather died in August of the year 2000. His birthday, a date that always felt special even aside from the holiday, was December 25th, Christmas Day. When he was still with us, it was our custom, almost a family rule, that on Christmas Day we would gather at my grandparents' house for a reunion. It did not matter how busy people were or what small disagreements might have been happening during the year. On that day we all came together, ate, laughed, opened gifts, and celebrated. That first December after his death, December 2000, was our first Christmas without him, and though everyone tried their best to make it happy for my grandmother's sake, there was an empty chair that no one could ignore. Our family, my parents, my sister, and I, went to my grandparents' house as usual, because that was what we had always done. We smiled, we greeted relatives, we helped prepare food, but underneath the surface there was a quiet sadness that all of us felt. Before we left for my grandparents, we had left our own house, which was miles away, in the care of our housekeepers and my nanny. This nanny had been with us since I was 3 years old, and she was more than just an employee. She was like another family member, someone who had watched me grow, who knew our routines and moods. While we were at my grandparents' house, sometime around lunchtime when we were all gathered together eating and trying to act normal, the telephone rang at our own home. Our nanny, being one of the only adults there, answered the call as she had done so many times before. What happened next shook her to the core. She later told us that when she lifted the receiver to her ear and said hello, she heard my grandfather's voice on the other end of the line. It was not a vague impression or a guess. She was certain. He greeted her the way he always did, in the familiar tone she recognized, and said, "Merry Christmas," then asked her to join us for lunch, as if he were inviting her to be where we all were at that very moment, celebrating at my grandparents' house. The sound of his voice, clear and distinct, coming months after his death, was too much for her. She burst into tears right there by the phone. Our housekeepers were alarmed and went to comfort her, trying to understand why she was crying so hard over a simple call. By the time we arrived home later that day, after the Christmas gathering had ended, she had calmed down enough to tell the story to us. She was still shaken, but she described everything in detail: the timing of the call, the tone of his voice, the greeting, and the invitation. As she spoke, I could not help but picture him as he had been when he was alive, sitting by the telephone, calling people the way he always did. Before he passed away, he had loved using the telephone so much that sometimes it seemed as though he could spend entire afternoons calling relatives and friends, chatting, asking about their day, inviting them over, or simply enjoying the connection. It was one of his habits, one of the things that made him who he was. Hearing that he had called our house on Christmas, in the first year he was not physically with us, made something inside me relax and smile. It felt like him, it sounded like him, and the message itself, "I am still here in some way, still calling, still inviting, still part of the family gathering," was exactly the kind of thing my grandfather would do. And so, even though all these events might sound strange or frightening to some people, when I look back on them now, I do not think only of fear or darkness. I think of a grandfather who loved his family, who struggled through illness, who held on to his faith, who fought against the pull of something sinister, and who, in the end, found his way toward the light he always believed in, stopping just long enough on the other side to let us know, through dreams and a phone call, that he had not completely left us, and that somewhere beyond what we can see, he was still himself. Still calling out with the same gentle voice that once told the little boy, "Toto, be good." This story is something that was passed down to me from my family, but it has never felt like just another old tale, because everyone who was there, everyone who witnessed it, still tells it the same way even today, and whenever my dad talks about it, I can see in his eyes that it is not just a story to him, it is a memory he would rather not relive too often. It happened when my dad was still in college, a time very different from now, when the place where they lived was not yet crowded with houses and paved roads. Back then, most of the streets were made of dirt, there were no street lights in many areas, and you could walk long stretches at night in complete darkness except for the moon and the stars. The native culture in their area was still strong, with beliefs, rituals, and stories that people actually lived by, and the things that were unseen were often taken just as seriously as the things that were visible. I first heard this story from my uncle, because he had witnessed part of what happened that night, but he told me that if I really wanted to understand it, I needed to ask my dad how it all began, because there was a part of the story that only my father knew, the part that happened before he reached home. When I finally asked my dad, he was reluctant at first, but he eventually shared it, and I will tell it now as it was told to me, starting with his side of it. At that time, my dad was very active in his school's student council, always organizing things, attending meetings, and helping with events. Because of this, he often stayed late at school, sometimes so late that he would be the last person there, the one responsible for closing up the classrooms, switching off the lights, and locking the gate behind him. One evening, it was already quite late. There were no other students around, and most of the teachers had gone home long before, when my dad finished what he was doing and started closing the building. While he was doing this, he heard the cry of a bird. To someone else, it might have sounded like just another night bird calling from a tree, nothing worth noticing, but my dad knew exactly what kind of bird it was and what it meant. In their indigenous language, there is a specific name for this bird, a name I unfortunately cannot remember now because I am not fluent in that language, but my dad called it a bird of the dead. It was not just a nickname. It was a creature tied to old beliefs, a bird whose cry was said to be connected to spirits and death. He had grown up hearing that this bird was a sign, and for him it was more than just superstition, because it had appeared near him before, always around times when death or spirits were close. One of the things he had learned as a child was how to tell its distance based on the sound of its call. If its cry was loud, it meant that the bird, and whatever it was connected to, was far away, but if the cry was soft, it meant that it was near. That night, as he listened, the bird's call was growing softer and softer, as if it was moving closer and closer to where he was. He said that this bird had haunted him while he was growing up, so when he heard it, he did not just shrug it off. He always felt that if that bird was nearby, the dead were not far behind. His whole body reacted with fear and urgency. Without wasting any more time, he dropped everything he was doing. He stopped worrying about locking every room properly, did not bother closing the gate the right way, and just rushed out of the school as fast as he could, driven by a deep instinct that told him he needed to leave that place immediately. As he reached the main street just outside the school and was about to cross to the other side, he saw a car pass by. At first, he thought it was just any vehicle, but as it came into view, he realized that it was a hearse, the kind of car used to transport the dead to funerals and cemeteries. He felt a strange and heavy feeling in his chest when he recognized it, a sense of dread that seemed to thicken the air around him. The hearse itself looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with its shape. It had a dim, glowing red light underneath and inside it, as if someone had installed soft neon lights beneath the body and along the interior, giving it an eerie, otherworldly glow. It was moving very slowly, much slower than a normal car should, as if it was drifting instead of driving, and what made it even stranger was that it produced no sound at all. There was no engine noise, no rolling of tires on the road, nothing. It simply slid past him silently, glowing red in the darkness. My dad's fear spiked at that moment. He could feel that something was terribly wrong, and he did not want to be anywhere near that vehicle. He increased his pace, walking as fast as he could, and then almost running. As he moved, he prayed under his breath, saying any prayer he could remember, calling on protection, trying to shield himself from whatever unseen presence might be around. Soon after that, he heard a loud rustling sound from nearby, like leaves being disturbed in a sudden rush. When he turned his head toward the noise, he saw something that made his body go cold, and the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was a large tree beside the road, and its leaves at the top were starting to spread outwards, as if someone was pushing them away from the center, evenly to both sides, like curtains being drawn back from a window. It was not just a few leaves stirred by a breeze. It was an organized movement, a clear, deliberate spreading. He looked around and realized that the wind was not blowing. None of the other trees were moving. Only this particular tree was being disturbed, and it was happening in a way that did not look natural at all. As he watched, the movement of the leaves continued, and then he began to see what was causing it. He saw large hands, big, unnatural hands, emerging among the branches, pushing the leaves aside. These hands were far too big to belong to a normal person, and to make things worse, this was not a small tree. It was tall and strong, but whatever was in it was bigger still. He panicked when he realized that he was not just looking at some odd play of shadows, but at something real, something powerful enough to move the tree like that. That was when his fear turned into pure survival instinct. He ran as fast as he could, no longer caring about how he must have looked, only focused on putting distance between himself and that place. As he ran, the bird's cry began to fade, becoming softer and softer until it disappeared entirely, and he took that as both a relief and a warning that things were changing around him. When he finally reached their barangay, the place where his home and community were, he slowed down just enough to catch his breath and looked back, thinking that now, because he was close to home, he would be safe. He hoped that whatever had been following him, whatever had been watching him, would not be able to cross into that familiar space. But when he turned around, he realized he had been wrong. The bird's cry was gone now, but in its place was something even more terrifying. He could see dead people behind him. These were not just shapes or shadows. He recognized them as human forms, people who appeared deceased, and they were following him and calling out his name. The way they said his name was not comforting or kind. It was eerie, stretched out, almost demanding. The sight terrified him so much that he turned away and ran harder than he had ever run before, forcing his legs to move as quickly as they could until he reached their house. This was where my uncle's part of the story began, because my dad later told us that his memory of that night stops right as he reached their house and opened the door to the living room. Everything after that was told to me by my uncle, who was there, and by other family members who witnessed it. According to them, when my dad burst through the front door into the living room, all the family members who were present at the time recoiled in fear. It was not my father himself who made them jump back, but what they saw behind him. From their position inside the house, they could see a figure looming behind my dad in the doorway, but they could not see its head from where they stood, only its massive body, and they said it was a giant. The figure was so large that it filled the doorway, blocking the space behind him, and it radiated a menacing aura that made their hearts pound and their bodies instinctively step away. My dad, on the other hand, looked like he was almost dead himself. His skin was extremely pale, drained of color, like someone who had been out in the cold for too long, or who had seen something that froze the blood in his veins. His hair was standing up all over the place, wild and disordered, as if he had been electrocuted or had walked through some powerful force that lifted every strand. His expression was blank, dazed, almost empty, as if he was there physically but his mind and spirit were still somewhere outside, being pulled in different directions. They quickly helped him inside and got him to lie down, trying to keep him calm and still. Someone placed a rosary around his neck, hoping that its presence would give him protection and strength, and the rest of the family gathered around him and began to pray, their voices rising together in desperate, overlapping pleas for safety. They prayed not only for him, but also against whatever had followed him, asking God and the saints to keep him from harm. My uncle said that as they were praying, they could hear people outside calling my dad's name, the same way he had heard it on the street, voices urging them to let him out, to allow him to come back outside. The sound was eerie and persistent, as if a crowd of unseen visitors had gathered just beyond the walls of the house. Inside, my dad became restless. Even in his weakened and shocked state, he seemed to respond to the calls outside. He tried to get up, his body straining against the hands holding him down. He wanted to go out, as if something was tugging at him, demanding that he step back outside and rejoin whatever waited for him there. My uncles and aunts had to hold him down with all their strength. He was normally not that strong, but in that moment, he had an almost unnatural force, and they said he nearly broke free more than once. If they had let their guard down even a little, he might have escaped their grasp and walked straight into the hands of whatever was outside. My grandmother was there that night, watching everything that was happening, and she took control of the situation. She was a very spiritual person, respected in the family for her knowledge of faith and the unseen. She believed in spirits and understood some of the ways people in their culture had learned to deal with such things. She told everyone what to do and what not to do, firmly guiding them with calm authority, even though the situation was terrifying. She went to the kitchen and took some salt, which is commonly used in many traditions as a form of protection or cleansing. She then prepared holy water, making the sign of the cross and saying prayers over it, transforming ordinary water into something sacred in their belief. Holding both the salt and the holy water, she walked outside the house, even though she knew that something dangerous and unseen was waiting there. She saw no visible figures with her eyes, but she could feel their presence, and she could hear the voices calling out my dad's name. With firm resolve, she threw the salt and the holy water toward the areas where she sensed them, and she spoke loudly, commanding the spirits to leave him alone, telling them that they had no right to take him, that he was not going with them tonight. My uncle said that after she did this, the spirits let out a kind of cry. No one could explain how they heard it, whether it was with their ears or in their minds, but it sounded like a mix of anger and sorrow, and then the presence faded. The voices stopped calling his name. The heaviness in the air lightened. Inside the house, my dad slowly began to return to normal. His color started to come back, his breathing became more regular, and his eyes, which had looked distant and lost, gradually cleared. Still, they did not stop praying. They continued their prayers all through the night, taking turns so that someone was always awake and watchful. My grandmother kept vigil until morning, staying alert in case anything tried to return. After that night, my dad changed some of his habits. He no longer stayed late at school to close the building by himself. He did not like walking alone at night anymore. The experience had left a deep mark on him. When he and my mom eventually started dating, she also had her own share of unsettling moments. She told me that sometimes, when they were together, she would hear the same kind of bird my dad had told her about, that bird of the dead, calling somewhere nearby. Whenever she mentioned it, my dad would respond in a calm but serious voice, saying, "They're there again." And the way he said it, with quiet certainty, would always send a chill down her spine because she believed in these things as well. Over the years, my dad shared many stories with me about his experiences growing up, and many of them involved strange encounters and unexplained events. But this story, the one with the bird, the hearse, the giant hands in the tree, the dead people following him home, and the spirits at the door, was the one he was most reluctant to talk about. When I first heard it, I thought it was too much, too far from what I considered believable. Part of me wondered if it had been exaggerated or distorted by time and fear. So later on, during a family reunion when many of the people who had been present that night were together, I decided to ask around. I asked my uncle to repeat the story. I asked other relatives who had been in the house that night, including those who helped hold my dad down, and every single one of them told the same version, with the same details: the giant figure behind him in the doorway, the way his hair stood on end, the voices calling from outside, my grandmother throwing salt and holy water, and the long night of prayer. The consistency of their memories, the seriousness in their voices, and the way my father's face tightens whenever the story is brought up all tell me that, as far as my family is concerned, this really happened. It may sound far-fetched to people on the outside, but for us, it is a reminder that there are things in this world that do not fit neatly into logic, and that sometimes the old beliefs, the ones tied to birds and spirits and prayers in the dark, have more truth in them than we would like to admit. It started with a simple warning, the kind of thing you might not take seriously at first, especially when life feels normal and your mind is busy with other things, and that warning came from my mom to my sister over the phone one day. My mother had called just to talk, but in the middle of the conversation her voice turned serious, and she told my sister that she needed to be careful over the coming week. Naturally, my sister asked her why, and that was when my mom explained that she had done a tawas for her. Tawas is a kind of folk ritual, something a lot of people back home still believe in. You melt candle wax and pour the hot wax into a bowl of water while saying a prayer, and then you look at the shapes the hardened wax makes to understand what kind of problem is bothering the person, whether it is sickness, bad luck, or sometimes even the attention of a spirit. My mom said that when she did the tawas for my sister, the shape that appeared in the water looked like a bed with a foot sticking out from underneath it, and in their belief that meant that a spirit would come by and visit. She tried to explain this over the phone, telling my sister what she saw and what it meant, but my sister, who was used to my mom's stories and warnings, did not really understand how serious it might be. She listened, said, "Okay," and then shrugged it off. She did not argue, but she also did not let herself think about it too much. Life was busy, there were things to do, and it was easier just to put that information aside and go on with her week as if nothing special had been said. The week my mom mentioned eventually arrived, and at that time my sister was living alone in her apartment. Her place was a small bungalow-style unit, low and compact, with everything on a single floor. It was simple but comfortable, and she was used to spending nights there by herself. Still, maybe because of the warning or maybe just because she did not like the idea of being alone for several nights in a row, she decided it would be better to have someone stay with her for a while. So she called our cousin and asked if she could come over and spend a week at her apartment. This cousin of ours is a very strong woman, both in personality and in faith. She is the kind of person who does not panic easily, someone who was raised around old beliefs and protective rituals, and she knows how to prepare herself when she feels something unseen might be lurking around. When my sister asked her to come, she agreed, and she did not come empty-handed. Meanwhile, on the day our cousin was supposed to arrive, my sister went out to meet her at the place where she would be dropped off. Our older brother came along, and so did our Auntie Fleur. To understand why what happened next felt strange, it helps to picture my aunt. She is very skinny and bony, with a thin frame that is easy to recognize from a distance. You could identify her from the way she walks and the shape of her shoulders alone. The four of them met up, my sister, our brother, our aunt, and our cousin, and then they all headed back to my sister's apartment together, ready to start the first day of my cousin's stay. They walked through the small yard and into the entrance. As they reached the door to the apartment, they naturally filed in one by one. My sister walked behind them, and from where she was, it looked like our aunt entered the apartment ahead of her along with the others. My sister clearly remembered seeing 3 figures pass through the doorway before her: our cousin, our brother, and Auntie Fleur, thin and bony just as always. Then my sister stepped inside last. As soon as she was in, she glanced around the room and something felt off. She only saw 2 people there, our older brother and our cousin. Auntie Fleur was nowhere to be seen. Confused, my sister looked at them and asked casually, "Hey, where's Auntie Fleur? Wasn't she with you? I could have sworn she went inside first." Both our brother and our cousin looked at her strangely, like she had just said something that made no sense. Our brother frowned and told her, "What are you talking about? We're the only ones who came." There was no trace of our aunt in the apartment. She had not actually been with them when they entered. To my sister, it was clear as day that she had seen a 3rd figure walking in front, and that figure had the height and shape of our skinny, bony aunt. But according to the others, that person did not exist. That was when, if you remembered my mom's tawas, the meaning became more unsettling. A spirit would come by and visit, the wax had said, and on that first day, it seemed like someone had already slipped inside in the shape of a familiar figure. The day went on, and life continued. After a while, our brother left, returning to his own place, and my cousin stayed behind as planned to take care of my sister and keep her company through the coming nights. The second day of my cousin's stay began in a way that should have been ordinary. It was morning, and the neighborhood was waking up. In that apartment complex, newspapers were usually delivered to each door so tenants could pick them up first thing in the day. It was part of my sister's routine to open her front door and grab the newspaper to start her morning. That day, she did the same thing, expecting to see the folded paper waiting on the step. But when she opened the door, she froze in surprise and confusion. Sitting there on the doorstep, right in front of her door, were 4 small kittens. At first glance, you might think that finding kittens would be cute, even lucky, but something was wrong. Each one of these kittens had a defect, something missing or twisted, as if they had been marked in some way. One kitten was missing an eye, its face uneven and sad. Another was missing a tail, the stub where it should have been looking raw and strange. A 3rd kitten was missing an ear, its head looking lopsided and unfinished. The 4th kitten was limping, one of its legs not working properly, so that it dragged and stumbled instead of walking normally. All 4 of them, tiny and vulnerable, were gathered on her doorstep like a strange offering. The image of these broken little animals all together, each one incomplete in a different way, made my sister's stomach twist. It felt off, like something out of a bad omen. She called out to my cousin in a panicked voice. When my cousin came over and saw the kittens, she did not react as strongly as my sister did, or at least she did not show it. Maybe she felt something, maybe not, but she chose to stay calm. She just said something like, "Shoo, shoo, go away," and gently waved at the kittens to send them off. The kittens scattered and went off down the path, and my cousin told my sister not to let it bother her too much. They stepped back inside and tried to continue their day as if it was just another strange but harmless event. But somewhere in the back of their minds, the sense that something out of the ordinary was visiting had already started to grow. The 3rd day of my cousin's stay was the one that truly shook them. It was evening, and the 2 of them were getting ready for bed. The apartment was quiet, the usual sounds of the outside world fading into the background as the night deepened. They lay down to sleep, trying to relax after another day of trying not to think too hard about the strange visitors at the door, and the shadow of my mother's warning. At some point in the night, they were both jolted awake by a sound. It was loud and sudden, a huge flapping noise followed by a heavy thud on the roof. The sound was so strong that it seemed to shake the air around them. My sister's heart began to race. She could feel her body trembling, and she started to cry, overwhelmed by fear. Then they heard something else, the sound of footsteps moving above them, heavy and deliberate, like something was walking across the roof, not just resting there. Along with the footsteps came a strange sound, a noise that repeated in short bursts. Eek eek eek, or tick tick tick. The odd part was that the sound did not seem to be directly overhead. It sounded like it was coming from far away, drifting in from the distance. At first, my sister tried to comfort herself by clinging to that detail. She whispered, half to herself, "It's quiet now, maybe that thing flew away," thinking that if the sound seemed far, then maybe whatever was up there was already gone. But my cousin knew better. She had grown up hearing about certain creatures from our folklore, beings that roamed at night and went after people or unborn babies. In our region, people talk about aswangs, or a kind of creature called a mananangle, which is said to separate its upper body and fly through the night searching for victims, often pregnant women, and it is said that one of the signs of its presence is that ticking or clicking sound. The trick of it, our elders say, is that if the sound is loud, it is actually far away, and if the sound is soft, that means it is close to you. So hearing it faintly from a distance is not a comfort, it is a warning. My cousin turned to my sister and said, not joking at all, "Gaga, that's a mananangle, an aswang. It's still there." Her voice was firm and serious. She knew what she was hearing. She had not come unprepared. In the bag she brought with her when she came to stay, she had packed more than clothes and toiletries. She had brought what she considered her spiritual armor, a bag of garlic, a bottle of holy water, and pieces of red fabric. We had been taught that this kind of creature does not like the smell of garlic and that holy water, blessed by a priest, offers protection. We had also been told that aswangs and similar beings do not like the color red, that it repels or weakens them in some way, so people sometimes hang red cloth or tie red ribbons to ward them off. As the strange noises continued above them, my cousin acted quickly. She took the garlic out of her bag and placed clothes along the window frames, making a kind of barrier. She also put some garlic near the bed and even rubbed a bit of it on my sister's skin, not caring if it left a smell, because protection was more important than comfort. She then took the red fabrics and hung them over the windows and around the bed, making the sleeping area a little island of red in the dim room. After that, she took the holy water and sprayed it on every corner she could reach, every nook and cranny of the room, including the windows, the door, and even my sister herself, drawing little crosses with the droplets and saying a prayer with each movement. Together they prayed, calling on God, the saints, and the angels to keep them safe. They lay in bed, the light red cloth hanging above them, holy water still damp on their skin, garlic scent rising in the room, listening as carefully as they could. After a while, they heard the sound again, another loud flap, another heavy thud, and then the sound of something lifting off and flying away. Whatever had been moving across the rooftop, whatever had been making the tick 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 sounds, finally flew off into the night. On the fourth and last day of my cousin's stay, it was evening once more, and by then both of them were exhausted from the tension of the past few nights. They went to bed again, hoping that the worst had already passed. The day had felt quiet and almost normal, and they were beginning to think that maybe the events were slowing down. Sometime in the middle of the night, as they slept in the dark room, my sister woke up to a new sound. It was a buzzing noise, low and constant, not from outside but from inside the room itself. At first, she could not tell where it was coming from. The room was pitch black, and as she blinked and let her eyes adjust slowly to the darkness, she had the unnerving impression that the walls themselves were moving. The shadows seemed to shift and crawl, like the solid surfaces of the room were alive. Her heart began to pound again, and she quickly reached over to wake up her cousin. When her cousin woke up and turned on the light, both of them finally saw what was happening. The sight that greeted them gave them one of the biggest shocks of their lives. The buzzing sound and the movement of the walls were not coming from ghosts or invisible monsters this time. They were coming from ants. The entire room was swarming with them. The walls were almost covered, turning from their normal color to an almost solid black, because there were so many ants crawling over them. They were everywhere, thousands of them, marching in lines and clusters, covering the surfaces, moving over each other, climbing higher and higher. Some ants were even flying around in the air, their tiny wings making the buzzing noise my sister had heard in her sleep. The floor, the corners, the edges of the ceiling, everywhere they looked, there were ants. It was not a normal appearance of a few insects. It was an infestation so intense that it felt like the room was being swallowed alive. Panic flooded both of them. My cousin rushed to the bathroom, grabbed whatever bug spray she could find, and began spraying the walls, the corners, the floor, any place where the ants were thickest. The strong smell of chemical filled the room, mixing with the leftover scent of garlic and the lingering dryness of fear. She sprayed until the can was empty, and even then the ants were still moving. She then grabbed a rolled-up newspaper and started hitting the areas where the insects remained, smashing them one by one, swatting at the flying ones, doing her best to kill as many as possible. It must have taken a long time before they managed to reduce the swarm to something more bearable, and even then, the feeling of being surrounded by tiny legs and crawling bodies stayed with them. After that terrible event, my sister's body reacted. She became sick, and red marks began to appear on her skin. She felt weak and unwell, and her condition got bad enough that she had to be taken to the hospital that same night. The whole week had been strange and heavy, from the warning of the Taoists and the phantom ant at the door, to the broken kittens on the step, the flapping and footsteps on the roof, the tick-tick-tick in the night, and finally the ants covering the walls. Whether you believe these things are all connected or not, to my sister and my cousin it felt like a series of attacks, like something had indeed come to visit, just as the candle wax had shown, and it had not been a friendly guest. It probably really began when I was around 3 or 4 years old, back when I still didn't have my own bedroom and slept in my mother's room every night. The layout of our house was simple. The door to our bedroom opened directly into the dining room, and from the side of the bed where I usually slept, I had a clear view of a painting hanging on the wall outside. It was a framed picture of the Last Supper, the kind many families have in their homes, and this particular one had been given to my parents as a wedding gift, so it had always been there for as long as I could remember. At that age I didn't think of it as anything special, just a religious painting that watched over our meals and our nights. But from my spot on the bed, lying on my side and staring out through the slightly open bedroom door, I could see the full scene clearly, all the disciples seated at the long table with Jesus in the center. For most children, it would just be a still picture, but to me, for reasons I didn't understand back then, it was different. For what I can remember, night after night I would stay awake long after my mother had fallen asleep beside me, waiting for the moment when the painting would come to life. The disciples, one by one, would begin to move in tiny, subtle ways. I would see them lean toward each other and whisper, their heads bending, turning slowly from side to side as if they were having private conversations. It was like watching people in real life, except they were inside the frame. I could even hear the sound of their whispers, soft and hushed, a low murmur of voices blending together, but I could never make out the words or understand what they were saying. Still, it didn't frighten me. To my young mind, it felt more like watching a movie or a secret show that only I could see. It was strange but not threatening, fascinating rather than terrifying. The only thing that stood out to me as truly odd was that while all the disciples moved, whispered, and turned their heads, Jesus remained completely still in the middle. He never moved at all. His eyes, his hands, his posture, all of it stayed exactly the same, as if he were frozen in place while the others around him lived and breathed inside the frame. I didn't know what that meant, but I accepted it as just how things were. One night, just like so many others, my mom had already fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady, while I was still lying awake, eyes fixed on the painting, waiting for the familiar, secret movements to begin again. Instead of the usual slow stirring of the disciples, something completely different happened. Without any warning, a man's head suddenly popped out of the wall, not from the door, not from the painting, but directly from the wall itself. It was as if the solid surface had simply opened and let his head through. His skin was extremely white, chalky and pale, like someone had covered him in white powder or like a piece of chalk had come to life. He was bald, with no hair on his head at all, and his face had a strange calmness to it. He turned his eyes toward me, looked directly at me, and in a friendly, casual tone said, "Hi!" I didn't feel fear the way you would expect a child to feel. Instead, I answered him naturally, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I replied, "Hello?" My voice, however, was enough to wake my mother from her sleep. She stirred and asked me who I was talking to. I pointed at the head sticking out of the wall and said, "That man." My mom, understandably worried and confused, got up and walked toward the direction I was pointing, checking the wall and the area near the door. But by the time she looked, the man's head was gone. She didn't see anything at all, just the solid, plain wall and the quiet, still hallway. She wasn't angry, but she was concerned, and I could tell from the way she looked at me and then at the wall again that what I was seeing and what she was seeing were not the same. The very next day, she went to church and asked the priest to come and bless our house. She told him about the strange things and asked for help. While we waited for the priest to come, I overheard her talking to one of our neighbors outside. She thought I wasn't paying attention, but even as a child I listened carefully. She spoke about how weird things had been happening in our house ever since I was only a month old. Apparently, there were signs and incidents that I was too young to remember, and she had been worried for a long time but kept it mostly to herself. When the priest finally arrived, he walked around the house, prayed, sprinkled holy water in every room, and blessed the entire place. After that, the painting changed for me. The disciples in the Last Supper no longer moved. They stopped whispering, their heads no longer turned, and the scene became completely still, just like any normal painting you see on a wall. I never again saw them shift or heard their soft voices. As for the white, bald man's head that had popped out of the wall, it never appeared to me again. Life went on, and with time those early memories faded a little into the background, though they never fully disappeared. Years passed, and I grew older. When I turned 7, about a week after my birthday, my mother and I went to a nearby town to visit one of her friends. This friend of hers owned a large piece of land, filled with tall coconut trees and big mango trees, the kind of wide, open property that feels half like a farm and half like a quiet forest. To a child, it was a great place to explore and play. My mother's friend had a son who was the same age as me, though now I can't remember his name anymore. While our mothers were inside the house, busy chatting, catching up on each other's lives, and talking about grown-up things, her son and I went outside to play together. We decided to play hide and seek, running among the coconut trunks and mango trees, laughing and trying to find the best hiding spots. The air was warm and smelled of soil and leaves, and everything seemed normal at first. Then, in the middle of our game, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Near one of the trees, not far from where I was standing, I saw a woman. She was standing beside the trunk, upright and completely still. She wore a white dress, but what made my heart pound was that the dress was covered in blood, stained and streaked with red in a way that looked horribly wrong. The sight of her was so shocking and frightening that every instinct in me reacted at once. I was not imagining a shadow or a trick of the light. To me, she was clear and solid one moment, and then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished into thin air. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone, leaving the tree and the empty ground beside it. Fear hit me hard. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, my voice high and loud, and I could not stop. My chest felt tight and my whole body trembled. Hearing my screams, my mother and her friend rushed outside toward us, running across the yard with worry on their faces, asking what had happened. When they reached me, my mother held me and tried to calm me down enough so I could talk. Between breaths and sobs, I told her what I had seen, the woman in the white dress full of blood standing by the tree, and then disappearing. Her friend turned to her son and asked him if he had seen the lady too. He looked genuinely confused and said, "No, he hadn't seen anything at all. It was just me." My mother apologized to her friend for the commotion and said we should probably go home. I did not stop talking about the lady in the bloody dress for the whole trip back. I kept repeating what I had seen, going over the details, the way she stood, the color of the blood, the way she vanished, as if saying it out loud would make someone else see it too or at least believe me completely. That night, after we got home, my body reacted strongly. I developed a high fever, burning hot, so bad that my mother decided she had to take me to the doctor. I felt weak and heavy, like my body was struggling with more than just a normal illness. The next day, after the checkup and some rest, my fever was gone as quickly as it had come. According to my mother, 2 days after that incident, she received a phone call from her friend, the one whose land we had visited. Her friend sounded serious, and maybe a little shaken. She told my mother that what I had experienced had made her curious about the history of her land, something she had never really looked into before. Because of what I saw and the way I reacted, she decided to do some research and talk to older people and checked into local stories. What she found out was disturbing. During the time when our country was colonized by the Japanese, long before she ever owned the land, there had been a horrible incident there. A local woman had been raped and killed on that very property. The land that now held coconut and mango trees, where her son and I had played, had once been the site of violence and tragedy. When my mother told me this, the memory of the blood-covered woman in white made a terrible kind of sense. From then on, I realized that there was something different about me, something I couldn't just dismiss. I was seeing things that other people either could not see at all or were not aware of in the same way. The painting that moved when no one else noticed, the white bald man's head that greeted me from the wall, the bloody woman in the field that only I could see, and the way my body reacted afterward, all of it added up to something I could no longer ignore. As I grew older, this sense only sharpened. I began to notice shadows that did not seem to belong to any object, apparitions that would appear briefly before fading away, strange-looking creatures that walked at the edge of my vision, and presences that felt darker and more frightening, which I could only describe as demons. It was not an ability I asked for, and it often scared me, but little by little I understood that, for better or worse, I could see things that normal people usually cannot. I have never really seen myself as a full believer in ghosts or other entities beyond us, not in the way some people are absolutely convinced, but I have also never been able to say that I do not believe at all. I live somewhere in the middle, in the space of maybe, where you question everything and doubt yourself but still cannot completely ignore what you have seen and felt. Even though I can sense and sometimes see things that other people around me do not seem to notice, I always end up telling myself that they must just be products of my imagination, strange tricks of the mind, thoughts that get out of control when I am tired, stressed, or alone. I repeat that explanation to myself over and over, almost like a shield, because it is easier to think I am imagining things than to accept that something unseen might really be there. My first encounter with something I could not explain happened when I was about 12 years old, back when I was still growing up in my aunt's house. That was the house where I spent most of my childhood, a place I knew well, with familiar walls, smells, and routines. One night, I was sleeping in bed next to my cousin's wife, who at that time was pregnant. We were sharing the bed, lying side by side, and everything was calm and quiet, just an ordinary night. At some point in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up, and what I saw at the foot of the bed almost made me jump out of my skin. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, was a figure. It looked like a person, but its entire body was pitch black, darker than the shadows in the room. I could not see any details of its clothes or its face except for two things, its eyes and its teeth. Its eyeballs were a reddish color that stood out sharply against the dark skin, and its teeth were a shocking white, almost glowing in the dim light, visible every time it smiled. I could not tell if it was male or female. It just sat there, facing me, smiling as if it was amused by my reaction. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my first instinct was to rub my eyes, to blink hard and hope that it was just a blur or an illusion brought on by sleepiness. I told myself that maybe I was still half asleep and that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I rubbed my eyes and looked again, the figure was still there, sitting calmly on the edge of the bed, staring directly at me with those reddish eyes and that wide, chilling smile. My cousin's pregnant wife was still asleep beside me, unaware of anything happening. I felt very alone in that moment, trapped between wanting to scream and not knowing what would happen if I did. Out of fear and instinct, I started saying the Lord's Prayer in my head, over and over. The words came out quickly, almost tumbling over each other, as if I believed that if I could just finish the prayer, I would be safe. As I prayed, I focused all my attention on the words, using them like a rope to pull myself away from the fear. Eventually, as I reached the end of the prayer, I looked again toward the edge of the bed and saw that the black figure was gone. There was nothing there anymore, just the empty space and the familiar outline of the bed in the dark room. That was the first time I truly saw something that did not make sense, something that no one else saw and that I could not easily explain away. After that night, it was as if something inside me had been opened. I started to see things more often, things that other people around me could not see. At first, I tried very hard to shrug them off, to shake my head and say, "No, that was nothing." But they continued to appear in different places and at different times. I am 29 years old now, and I have had dozens of experiences since that first one. Some were quick, small glimpses, like catching a shadow moving in the corner of my eye where nothing should be, or seeing a figure standing at the end of a hallway that suddenly vanishes when I blink. Others were more intense, like feeling a presence behind me when I am alone, or hearing a voice that no one else hears. After so many years and so many strange little moments, I often find myself questioning my own mind. Are these things really there, or am I simply letting my imagination run wild again and again? It is hard not to doubt when no one else around you shares what you are seeing. There was a time when I tried to be honest and open about what I perceived. Once, at work, I saw someone standing beside one of my coworkers. It was not just a vague feeling. I really saw a figure, as clearly as I saw my coworker herself. The presence stood right next to her, close enough that it made me feel uneasy. Without thinking about how she might react, I told her, "There is someone beside you." I meant it as a factual observation, not a joke. As soon as she heard me say that, she freaked out. Her face changed with fear and discomfort, and I could see that my words had truly disturbed her. That reaction made me feel guilty and strange, like I had done something wrong just by telling the truth about what I saw. After that, I stopped saying anything whenever I saw something near someone. Now, whenever people asked me questions, or when I sensed something around them, I usually just smile and keep quiet. I do not want people to see me as weird or crazy. I do not want them to think that I am some kind of freak who sees ghosts everywhere. I just want to be normal like everyone else, to be treated like a regular person without anyone wondering what strange things I am seeing all the time. Another experience that stayed with me happened in the sleeping room at my old office. It was a room meant for rest, a place where employees who work long hours or graveyard shifts could take quick naps during their breaks. From the first time I stepped into that room, I could sense that there was something there, something heavy and dark, as if the air itself carried a weight that did not exist in the other parts of the office. I could not see exactly what it was, but my body and my instincts told me that I was not alone whenever I entered that room. At that time, I was working the graveyard shift, which meant my schedule was upside down compared to most people's. During breaks, especially in the middle of the night when everything was quiet and the office was almost empty, I would go into the sleeping room and lie down for short naps so that I could get through the rest of my shift. One night, I decided to go to work very early, about 4 hours before my shift officially started. I was tired and thought I might as well spend that extra time sleeping in the office sleeping room instead of at home. So I went in, lay down, and eventually fell asleep. After a few hours, something strange happened. I felt the need to wake up. My mind became alert, and I was fully aware of my surroundings, but when I tried to move, I realized that I couldn't. My eyes were open, and I could see the room around me, but my body would not respond. It was as if an invisible weight was pinning me down. I could hear people talking outside the room in the hallway, their voices faint but clear, so I knew I was not dreaming. I knew I was awake. Still, I could not lift my hand, could not move my legs, could not even turn my head. Panic slowly began to rise in my chest. As I lay there, completely unable to move, I felt something else. There was a black smoke-like shape pressing down on my chest, heavy and suffocating. It felt as if this dark fog was trying to choke me, crushing my lungs and stealing my breath. I struggled inside, wanting to scream, to call for help, but my mouth refused to open. My body refused to respond. Even though I could not speak aloud, I started saying the Lord's Prayer in my mind, clinging to it like a lifeline. As I repeated the prayer silently, word by word, the pressure on my chest slowly began to ease. Little by little, I felt control returning to my body. Eventually, I could move my fingers, then my arms, then the rest of me. The black smoke seemed to fade away as if it had never been there. When I finally managed to sit up, I was shaking. It was terrifying, and yet, I also tried to be rational about it. I told myself that maybe it was sleep paralysis, something I had heard about before, a condition where your body is temporarily stuck between sleep and wakefulness. Many people experience it and feel like something is pressing on their chest, so maybe that was all it was, a physical phenomenon with a scientific explanation. But at the same time, there was this other feeling that told me that there was more to it than that, especially because I had already sensed something dark in that room before. I was not the only one either. A lot of my coworkers had similar experiences in that same room. They told stories about waking up unable to move, feeling strange pressure, or having disturbing dreams whenever they slept there. The pattern became so common that we eventually started calling it the nightmare room, instead of the sleeping room. Even though I tried to convince myself that it might just be sleep paralysis and tiredness, I still never went back in there again after that incident. Now I work in a different office, a new building with different rooms and a different environment, but the strange experiences have not completely stopped. Even here, I can still sometimes see things out of the corner of my eye, or sense a presence standing by a doorway or near someone's desk. People will ask me sometimes if I ever feel anything unusual, especially when they share their own stories or jokes about ghosts, and most of the time I just smile and give a vague answer. Inside, I feel a mix of doubt and frustration. I ask myself over and over, am I just imagining things too much? I do not want this. I do not wake up in the morning wishing to see shadows or feel presences. I do not go into a room hoping that something will appear. They just show themselves whenever they want, on their own terms, without warning and without my permission. Sometimes I manage to convince myself that they are not real at all, that everything I think I see is just my imagination running wild because of stress, fatigue, or old fears. Other times, when something feels too real, too solid, or happens at the same time another person also feels something, I start to wonder again. I stand there, caught between belief and denial, not sure which side to choose, and honestly, I just do not know anymore. My dad's house is more than 60 years old now, an old structure that has stood through different seasons of our family's life, and I grew up within its walls with a lot of warm memories of my childhood, so many moments of laughter, ordinary days, and simple happiness that it is hard for me not to feel attached to it in a deep way, even if the neighborhood around it has changed so much over the years. Where there used to be more open spaces, quieter streets, and familiar faces, there are now more buildings, more people, more noise, and a faster pace of life, but the house itself has kept most of its old charm, with its aging wood, its creaking steps, its old-fashioned layout, and that feeling you get when you walk into it that time inside moves differently than it does outside. To strangers, it might just look like an old family home, a little worn but still sturdy, but to me it is layered with memories, the sounds of my parents' voices, the smell of meals cooking in the kitchen, the echo of childhood games on the stairs, and the quiet times when someone sits alone in the living room thinking of the past. At the same time, as much as I love this house, I have to admit that it is not just made of wood and stone and memories. I do not like to use the word haunted, because to me that word suggests something purely evil or something meant only to frighten and harm, and I do not quite see it that way. But there have been enough events, enough strange and unexplained things, that it would be dishonest to say that nothing unusual ever happens here. There are occurrences that stand out, things that make you stop and think, moments that stick in your mind and whisper that you are not the only ones living in this place. And these events have continued happening, not just long ago but even up to the present day. One of the most recent stories involves my aunt, my dad's sister, who came to visit us not too long ago. She lives in Leyte, which is a neighboring island, and she came over to Cebu because she needed to pick up her son. It was the beginning of summer in the Philippines, that time of year when the air is hot and heavy but full of a kind of restless excitement because schools are finally closed for a couple of months. Her son studies here in the city during the school year, staying at a dormitory like many other students who come from nearby provinces. Since the dorms also closed during the break, they planned to spend a couple of days in the city doing some shopping, buying what they needed to bring back home, before taking a ferry back to their town. They asked if they could stay with us for a short while, and my dad and I readily agreed. After all, this house has more rooms than occupants now. As people moved out, married, or passed away, the number of people living here slowly decreased, but the rooms stayed, waiting quietly, their doors closed most of the time. It felt nice to have relatives come and fill those empty spaces again, even just for a few days. My aunt had already heard some of the strange stories about this house, bits and pieces collected from different relatives who had stayed with us before or heard us talk during family gatherings. I am sure that part of her was uneasy at the thought of spending the night in a place with that kind of reputation, especially because we do not just tell ghost stories for fun. We talk about experiences that people we know actually had here. But she is also a practical woman, and maybe she told herself that it would only be for a couple of nights, that she was not coming to stay forever, so she agreed anyway. When it came time to decide which room she and her son would use, we offered her different options. She eventually chose the smallest bedroom upstairs, the one that is directly above the front door. It is a simple little room, not very big, but it has a window that lets in a good amount of light during the day. We suggested that she might be more comfortable staying in one of the larger rooms, especially the one with the air conditioning, because the heat this time of year can be quite intense, but she shook her head and refused. She said she felt more comfortable in smaller rooms, that she preferred spaces that felt snug rather than wide and open, and besides, she pointed out, the room was well lit and felt cozy. That was her reasoning, and we respected her choice. At first everything went smoothly. They arrived, we talked, they rested, and there were no obvious signs that anything was wrong. But the night before they were scheduled to leave Cebu, something happened that changed the feeling of her stay. That evening, my aunt went out to have dinner with some of her old friends in the city. She does not come to Cebu very often, so it made sense that she wanted to catch up with people she had not seen in a long time. She left the house after sunset, and the hours passed quietly for us at home. Around 10:30 p.m., she returned. She came inside, greeted me, and we chatted for a while in that relaxed way people do after a good meal, exchanging bits of news, laughing a little, talking about her son's studies and the ferry schedule for the next day. Everything felt completely normal. After a short conversation, she said she was tired and decided to go upstairs to her room to sleep. I stayed downstairs in the living room, watching TV, letting the familiar sounds of the house at night surround me, while my dad, who is older now and no longer as strong as he used to be, had already gone to bed earlier. He rarely goes upstairs these days because his knees are weak and the stairs are rather steep. It is hard for him to climb up and down, so he usually stays on the ground floor. Not long after my aunt went up to her room, I saw her come down the stairs again. She looked a little confused and asked me if I had been trying to call her from downstairs. I told her that I had not called her at all. I had been in the living room watching TV the entire time, and I had not left my spot. It certainly was not my dad calling her either, because he was already asleep and, as I mentioned, he rarely goes upstairs at all anymore. Her son, my cousin, was not in the house yet. He was still out with his friends, probably enjoying his last night in the city before going back home. I could see from the look on her face that she had really heard something, so it was not just a casual question. She said that she clearly heard someone calling her name, as if someone from downstairs or the hallway was trying to get her attention. She had assumed it was me or perhaps my dad, which was why she had come down to check. But when she saw me sitting alone in front of the television and heard that I had not called her, a faint worry seemed to touch her expression. We shrugged it off the best we could, trying not to make too much of it. Maybe she thought she had been mistaken. Maybe I suggested that it could have been a sound from outside or from another house, though deep down I knew the layout of our place well and knew how clearly voices inside it can travel. She went back upstairs to her room again to try to sleep. Some time passed, and I continued watching TV, the light from the screen flickering across the living room, the rest of the house mostly dark and quiet. Then, once again, my aunt came down the stairs. This time she looked more shaken than before, her face a little paler, her movements slightly more tense. She asked again if either my dad or I had been calling her, but I gave her the same answer. No, I had not called her at all, and my dad was still in his room. She said that the second time the voice called her, it sounded more insistent, like it was not just casually calling her name, but almost demanding that she answer. She also experienced knocking on her door, clear knocks that sounded as if someone was right outside her room asking to be let in. I had not heard any knocking myself. From where I was downstairs, the house had stayed completely quiet, apart from the sound of the television. That difference, that she heard voices and knocking while I heard nothing at all, only added to the unsettling feeling. To help her feel safer, I told her that I would move to my own bedroom and continue watching TV there, but that I would leave my bedroom door open so that there would be a clear line of sight and sound between upstairs and downstairs. I thought that if she knew that I was still awake and within hearing distance, it might make her feel less alone. Maybe that step helped, because after that second time, she did not come out of her room again that night. I did not hear any more footsteps on the stairs. Eventually I turned off the TV and went to sleep myself, and the house fell into its usual quiet, only the small sounds of pipes and the distant noises of the street breaking the silence. The real shock came the next morning. When my aunt came down for breakfast, she looked pale and was visibly trembling. Her hands shook slightly as she held her cup, and even her voice seemed unsteady. My dad and I could tell right away that something had disturbed her badly. We asked her what was wrong, and she began to tell us what had happened earlier that morning in her room. She said that when she first woke up, she did not get out of bed immediately. Their ferry was not scheduled to leave until later in the afternoon, so there was no rush to pack or hurry out the door. She decided to lie in bed for a while longer, just resting and thinking, maybe listening to the sounds of the house waking up. Then, for reasons she could not explain, she turned her head and looked toward the window. The window in that small room overlooks the front area of the house, and from that height you can normally see the street and the space in front of the door. What she saw made her blood run cold. She said she saw a lady pass by slowly outside the window. At first, she did not think much of it. The image simply registered in her mind as a woman walking past, moving in a calm, unhurried way. For a heartbeat or two, her mind treated it as something ordinary. But then something clicked inside her. She realized where she was. She was on the second floor, in a room that was located directly above the front door, and the window was about 8 or so feet above the pavement. There is no balcony there, no ledge, no walkway, nothing that a person could step on to pass right in front of that window at eye level. Yet the lady she saw seemed to glide past it as easily as if she were walking on solid ground. That was when the fear hit her. She understood that what she had just seen could not possibly be a normal person walking on the street. It did not make sense physically. The height was all wrong. The angle was impossible. The woman had been too close to the glass, too level with her eyes. My aunt described the lady as moving slowly, almost gracefully, and although she did not go into every detail of what the lady looked like, there was something about her description that made an old, familiar story stir in my memory. The way she saw the figure outside the window reminded me of the ghost my brother has seen several times around the house. He has had his own experiences over the years, and he had described, on more than one occasion, a female figure appearing in certain areas. My mind could not help but connect the two, my brother's past sightings and my aunt's fresh encounter. The idea that it might be the same entity roaming around, appearing at different times to different people, made me feel a mix of dread and strange confirmation. My aunt was so frightened by what she had experienced, the strange voice calling her name, the knocking on her door, and finally the sight of the lady gliding past her second-floor window, that she decided she did not want to stay in the house any longer than necessary. Instead of resting and waiting comfortably at home before their afternoon ferry, she chose to spend the remaining hours at a mall, walking around in a public place full of people, noises, and bright lights, anything that would make her feel grounded and far away from the quiet, watchful corners of our old house. We did not argue with her about it. We understood. It is one thing to hear stories about a place, to laugh about them during family gatherings, to treat them like interesting tales that happen to other people, and it is another thing entirely to lie in a dark room and hear a disembodied voice call you repeatedly, to hear knocks that no one else hears, and to watch a woman pass by a window where no human being should be able to walk. For my aunt, those couple of days in our home reminded her that the house really does have something extra in it, something invisible but strong enough to reach out to new visitors and make its presence felt. For me and my dad, it was just another chapter in the long, strange relationship we have with this old house, a place that holds not only the memories of the living but also, it seems, the quiet, lingering footsteps of those who are no longer among us.